the fact that Paul's objection is who can resist his will? Why is it fair for God to blame us for things he decreed we would do? That person Paul is anticipating is objecting to God unconditionally electing and reprobating people.
And I would like you to explain, how is it that the hardened person is anticipated by Paul as to not stumble beyond recovery, possibly be provoked for envy, and possibly still be saved if he's representing this so-called reprobate?
The floor, Dr. Flowers, what would you say about any Bible passages, not necessarily Romans 9? We don't have to talk about Romans 9. We could if you want.
Yeah, I think it's probably the linchpin passage that is probably the biggest apologetic for Calvinism. And I already made a comment about how I believe it's really speaking more corporately about Israel. Israel is the objects of wrath that are prepared for destruction based upon their choices as a nation. They have rebelled against God over time. Generally speaking, the nation of Israel has become calloused and hardened in their self-righteousness, and he's held out his hands to them all day long. It's not because they were created that way or they were born that way and they couldn't have done otherwise. It's a result of them, their rejection, and now they're being judicially hardened, which means to be strengthened in their resolve. So much like Pharaoh was strengthened in his already rebellious resolve, so too Israel is being strengthened in their already rebellious resolve to bring about the Passover. The first Passover brought out through the hardening of Pharaoh, the second Passover through the hardening of Israel. So it's not anything to do with double predestination or the way they were born. It has to do with God's redemptive plan through the nation of Israel, his chosen people, and now him hardening these chosen people so as to engraft the Gentile nations, the ones who aren't chosen, presumably. And that's the narrative I see unfolding from Romans 9 through 11. I don't see anything about individuals being chosen for effectual salvation, which I think is being read into the text based upon a more Augustinian Calvinistic reading. And so obviously you can spend hours talking about any particular verse, but that's in general the differences between our views, I think.
Okay, so first I think we should talk about where we have agreement. You talk about how there's like election is a collective thing. God elects the nation of Israel. In a sense, I do believe in corporate election. I think it's very important to have a Christ-centered doctrine of election. Calvin really emphasized this too. Calvin said, well, he does believe that, yes, there is individual election. He says we're not supposed to speculate on that. And Calvin says, as far as we're concerned, from our perspective, Calvin's basically an Arminian, because Calvin said we do not find our election in ourselves or even in God the Father, but only by looking to Christ. And Karl Barth is very good at reminding the Reformed tradition to be Christocentric, to not speculate on the secret will of God the Father, because God's secret will is, election and reprobation, but God's revealed will, the only thing we're supposed to really speculate on is what he has revealed in Christ, who he has chosen to be for us in Christ, and it's that whosoever believes shall be saved. So in a sense, you can use Arminian sounding language about the gospel. You can say, if you choose to believe the gospel, you will be saved. If you do choose to not believe the gospel, you will not be saved. As Calvinists, we have nothing wrong with that sort of language because there's a sense in which it's absolutely true. But now let's talk about where we disagree. So you said that Romans 9 does not have anything to do with individual election reprobation, and that God's hardening of people is only a judicial hardening after they have already committed evil and have already rejected God with their free will, right? Is that what you said?
More in specific or more particular of Israel themselves, because he's talking about the nation of Israel that's become these objects of wrath because of their rebellion and now being hardened in that rebellion. And he holds out hope that they haven't stumbled beyond recovery, that they might be provoked to envy and grafted back in. So that can't be the reprobate of Calvinism if Paul himself holds out hope that those same hardened people are going to be saved in chapter 11. So that's one of the reasons I would reject the individualized reading of Romans 9.
Right. So I agree. Romans 9 is about Israel, where Paul says that God will save all Israel, just in the fact that the ethnic Jewish nation has rejected God does not change that, because Paul is saying the true Israel is not based on ethnicity, but it's based on God's election. Faith. Based on God's election. So
faith.
Yes,
God elects those with faith.
I would agree.
So
yes,
we're saying this, we would be saying the same thing.
Yeah. So
but
now,
it's God can establish covenant with whomever he wants to. He can establish covenant with people that are Israelites or not, with people that he can choose. But who is he choosing? He's choosing those who refuse to not bow a knee to Baal, those who have allegiance towards him. That's who he chooses to have covenant. That's true Israel. True Israel are those with faith, regardless of their nationality. That's what we would say. Now the question is, how do they come to faith? And that gets back to the predestination question.
I was going to address. So you say that reprobation is only like a judicial hardening after people have already, after like Israel or Pharaoh or whoever has already made reject God. But it says that God hated Esau, and hated just means loved less. But we would say hated means reprobate. God reprobated or hated Esau. It says in Romans 9 before he had done anything good or bad. So that's an example of God reprobating an individual before that individual had committed any actual sin. Now, we would say that God does not damn people based on nothing. God might damn people based on their original sin and actual sin. But Romans 9 has a specific example of, it says God hated Esau, and it is very clear the election of Jacob and the reprobation of Esau was before the twins had done anything good or bad.
So if that's reprobation, then didn't Esau get reprobated before he did anything bad?
There's a difference between reprobation and damnation. Reprobation is just the decree to not give grace, and damnation is actually a judicial punishment, a decree for punishment. So we would say that reprobation is chronologically before the foundation of the world, but reprobation isn't the same as the sentence of damnation. Reprobation is simply the absence of positive election unto salvation.
So what is the basis on which he's being reprobated if he hasn't done anything bad yet?
Nothing. Again, reprobation isn't the same as damnation. Reprobation is reprobation is not a positive decree, it's a negative decree. It's the decree to not give saving grace. So
saving
if someone
grace for what? He hadn't done anything bad yet.
It's that could go into the whole infralapsarian versus superlapsarian debate. But the text says that before the twins had done anything good or bad, God loved Jacob more than he loved Esau. So we would say that in some sense, God does love the elect more than the non-elect. We would also say that God has love for everyone he created. It's impossible for God to not love the good, and it's impossible for God to not create something that has some good in it. But if God only elects based on foreseen human free will choice or merit, then why does it say God hated Esau, an individual, before he had done anything good or bad?
Well, just like you alluded to, the fact that he has a preference for one over another for a purpose, like he says in John when he says, if you hate your mother and father, you must hate your mother and father to follow me. What's he saying? You prefer me over them. He obviously doesn't literally mean to hate or despise them. He means you choose me over them. Well, God is choosing Jacob over Esau for what purpose? To save one and to damn the other? No. To use one for the noble cause, the noble purpose, the seed by which all the families of the earth would be blessed. That's the promise he made to Abraham in Genesis 12:3, that through your seed, through Isaac, not Ishmael, through Jacob, not Esau, all the families of the earth will be blessed through the seed, singular, Jesus, who will come through them, and all the families of them will be blessed through the seed that I've chosen. So he's choosing them not for salvation, he's choosing them for a noble purpose, and God has a right to do that. Now, why would he bring that up? Because the Edomites were rebelling against God. That's when he declared his hatred over them, not arbitrarily, but he declared his hatred. Before that, he said, don't despise the Edomites, for they are your brother. And he protected them and gave them land, just like he did for the Ishmaelites. And so God's always protected and loved and shown grace to these other children of Abraham. But the salvation, seed of salvation the Christ came through Isaac and then Jacob, the second born, not the firstborn. And so this is Paul rehashing history to demonstrate how God has the right as the sovereign to establish covenant with whomever he wants to, those of the Gentiles or those of the Gentiles, of the Jews, and of the faithful, regardless of what nationality they come from. And so the objector in Paul's mind is the same objector we see back in Romans chapter 3, who said, if our unrighteousness brings about your righteousness, then why are you to blame us? Well, that's a Jew saying, if our sin, crucify Jesus, if that's actually a part of your redeemed plan, then why are you to blame me if that's part of your plan to bring a redemption for the world, for the greater good? It's exactly the same interlocutor, the objector in Romans 9. It's the Jew who's now being hardened in his already rebellious condition, just like Pharaoh was, to bring about God's purpose and redemption. That's the interlocutor. It's not a reprobate or somebody selected for damnation before the foundation of the world. And so we think the Calvinist is reading soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, into the text when it's really about God choosing the nation for a service, for redemption for all people.
Yeah, let him come back in, Leighton.
Okay, so that is I think you could exegete the first part of Romans 9 to be like that. And that is the classic non-Calvinistic interpretation of it. But the reason I was not convinced by that when I was opposed to Calvinism is because the objection that Paul anticipates is exactly the same as the classic objection to Calvinism, which is, why does God still blame us, for who is able to resist his will? Like, that's Paul's opportunity to say, oh, don't worry, this is like a collective judgment on Israel as a collective group, and it's not about salvation, it's about some like honoring and purpose and stuff. Like, that's God's chance to say that. This is sort of like in my debates with Roman Catholics, they'll say Paul is not teaching salvation by faith alone. If that's the case, why does Paul anticipate the classic objection to salvation by faith alone, which is, shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? Or when I talk to people who don't believe in that Christ is really present in communion, they'll say, oh, well, John 6, Jesus isn't talking about communion. He's talking about, it's like some metaphor. Okay, well, why didn't Jesus say it was a metaphor when they gave the obvious example? When they gave the obvious response to Jesus saying you need to eat his flesh and drink his blood. So in this case, I would say that the fact that Paul's objection is, who can resist his will? Why is it fair for God to blame us for things he decreed we would do? That person Paul is anticipating is objecting to God unconditionally electing and reprobating people.
Okay, again, I already answered that issue because I showed you how a Jew who has grown calloused and hardened in his self-righteousness would find out from Paul that I crucified my own Messiah. I cried out, crucify him. And that was a part of the redemption plan that God had planned from the beginning, to use me in my rebellion and to harden me in my rebellion and to blind me from the truth using parabolic language in order to bring about the crucifixion. Why are you to blame me now, God, if that was your plan from the beginning? That is the objector from our perspective, and it has nothing to do with him being reprobated or chosen for salvation. In fact, Paul even holds out hope for that same hardened Jew not to have stumbled beyond recovery, to be provoked to envy so as to be saved. And I would like you to explain, how is it that the hardened person is anticipated by Paul as to not stumble beyond recovery, possibly be provoked for envy, and possibly still be saved if he's representing this so-called reprobate?